Okay, so thank you for joining us for today's Harmony Day Virtual Living Library. This next guest presenter we're excited to have join us. Her name is Bree Sproule. Bree was born and raised in the Okanagan. She identifies as a deaf person and has been like that since birth. She communicates through her hands using American Sign Language, and we have her interpreter, Jill, who is joining us with her. Bree's had a chance to travel the world for fun. She's competed in high-level sports competitions such as the Deaf Olympics. She is here today to come and share her story, her journey as a minority in this big world that we live in. So we are very pleased to have Bree join us. Welcome, Bree.
Great. Thank you so much, Tobias, for that introduction. Hi, everyone. I'm Bree Sproule. This is my sign name, Bree, which is part of my identity as well, part of my culture. As a deaf person, I'm honored to have a sign name. It's sort of related to the fact that I'm always smiling and in the shape of a bee for Bree. So nice to meet you. I'm so grateful that I was invited to be a part of this event. I feel very honored. And just before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the land that we meet on here today, the ancestral and unceded stolen lands of the Syilx Nation Okanagan people. And I feel very grateful that we all get to live, work, and play on this land. So thank you very much. As uninvited settlers, we're very privileged to be here. So thank you. And Limp, which is thank you in Syilx. So I guess I'll talk a little bit about my background. Please let me know if I'm going on too long. I don't want to take up all your time. So as Tobias said, I was born deaf and I use ASL as my language. I am the 6th child in my family and they're all hearing. So of course, when I was born, my family just assumed I was hearing as well. But then by the time I was 1 and still not really responding to anything, I was a very quiet baby, just sort of, kind of getting lost in the background of all the kids. And they finally brought me in for testing and found out that I was profoundly deaf. I had absolutely no hearing. So the hairs in the cochlea that send the messages to the brain were not there. So I don't hear a single thing. And they didn't really know why I was deaf. Nobody was sick in the family. There was no measles or scarlet fever, which was a common cause of deafness at that time. So they didn't know how to communicate with me because obviously I couldn't hear. So they did a little research and realized that learning ASL would be the best way to go. And ASL is my first language. I was very lucky that my parents learned to sign because it's not common that parents would do that. And I'll explain a little bit more about that later. Interestingly, I just found out, we did a little research, and about 4 generations back in my family, we have my great grandfather who was deaf and met his wife in Norway in the deaf school there. And then it skipped all those generations and finally ended up here. So potentially, I may have that gene. My husband is deaf. He's 3rd generation deaf. So who knows, maybe when we start a family, our child will be deaf, which will be a nice surprise. But what we care most about is that they're healthy, of course. So I'll give you a little bit of a story about my educational background. I grew up here. I went to Oyama Traditional Elementary School. And was just in the regular hearing program. I know it was the traditional school and now it's the elementary school or vice versa. So I went there and then I went to George Eliot and did my high school there, graduated in 2012. That was, gosh, almost 10 years ago. I can't believe it. Time has gone by fast. So I was what's called as mainstreamed, which means that I was like the one deaf person in the whole school who was hearing. There were a few other deaf and hard of hearing students around the district. And so they were able to make sort of a deaf and hard of hearing program for us to get some extra support from a teacher of the deaf. So in the regular classroom, I had an interpreter. Now the interpreter doesn't help me. They just facilitate the communication. The school system is not designed for deaf people. Obviously, it's designed for hearing people. And as a minority, I have had to make those modifications on the other end. So when there were other classes that would not have been suitable for me, I would be pulled out of those classes, like French or music. I mean, English is my second language. ASL is my first. So then learning French on top of that would not have been very beneficial. And my English might be like your French, it's not first language. So there's definitely a bit of a struggle there. So I would be pulled out and I would work with the deaf program and get some extra support, which was really great. Then when I graduated high school, I realized I was going to need obviously some further education so I could have a good career in the future. So I looked into Gallaudet University in Washington, D.C., right near where the White House is, where the American president is, right there. This university is really unique because it's the only liberal arts deaf university in the world. And everyone there uses sign language. I mean, if you can imagine going to Disneyland, how awesome that would be for you. This was like deaf Disneyland. Everybody signs, everything was accessible. All the teachers, all the students in the library, everybody was using ASL. The athletics, the coaching, it was just amazing. I got to tell you, it was so overwhelming at first because I was mainstreamed. I was in a small town as like the only deaf person. So what a culture shock to be in there. And then, it just became my second home. So I did my 4 years, got my bachelor in social work, went back home, missed deaf Disneyland, so went back to Gallaudet and went after my master's. And I took my master's in social work. I care very much about representing and supporting and advocating for children, and especially deaf children. So a little bit back to my youth. I was very involved in sports in high school and other leagues and clubs. My parents really wanted to keep me out of trouble, so definitely encouraged me to be involved in sports, which I think was a win. So I was on the club team. I also was on the Deaf Olympic team. My focus was track and field, soccer, volleyball, basketball. And now, as you know, the Olympics are happening in China right now. And after the Olympics, as you may know, they have the Paralympics for people with other physical impairments. Then after that is the Deaf Olympics. And it's not actually like around the same time. It's usually about a year out. But all the athletes are deaf from all over the world. We all come together and play our sports and challenge each other and compete at such a high level. So I was on the volleyball team. I played on the national volleyball team for 6 years and traveled all over the world. It was such a rich experience. So amazing to meet all these deaf people from all over the world. And just so you know, they do not use ASL. They use their own national sign language. Just like if you go to France, they're speaking French. Well, if you meet a French deaf person, they're using French sign language. And it was really great to just sort of gesture with each other while we picked up each other's language, and how easy it was to communicate just because of the nature of sign language being based in gesture. We were able to communicate so richly, so quickly. And I wanted to give you a little sort of fun fact. You know, in football, the huddle, maybe you guys saw the Super Bowl on the weekend. You saw that they do the huddle, where all the athletes come together and crouch around and have their little secret plans and strategize, and then they go and play. The huddle was actually created because way back when at Gallaudet University, when they were playing other deaf athletes, they would sign their strategy, but everybody could see what they were signing. So they had to huddle and get in and hide their signs. And that ended up being something that translated into regular hearing football, and the tradition of football play is having that huddle. So it's kind of cool that it originated with deaf athletes. There's always something cool happening behind the scenes where, potentially there was a deaf person who started something like that. So yeah, the huddle came from us. After I graduated Gallaudet, I came back home. I realized I needed to get a job to pay for my education. And I saw that there was a position in Saskatchewan. Very cold there. I got offered a job to work as a preschool teacher in Saskatoon. Now, Saskatoon really is a lot different with regards to, say, Vancouver or even BC in general. Their resources are quite behind, and they were wanting to develop a preschool for deaf and hard of hearing students as well as CODA students. So CODA students are children of deaf adults. So they wanted to develop this project to help enrich the language access for these students. So they had a government grant. It was a pilot project, a 2-year pilot project. And I was hired to develop this program. I thought I was hired to teach, and I was hired to develop the whole program. So I had to figure out what we needed. I needed to advocate it. And we wanted to fill in those gaps with that language deprivation that happens for many deaf and hard of hearing students. So we had the government grant and invested it all and built this amazing program, and it took off. It was a huge success. So after those 2 years, I was ready to go back to BC. I had been all over the place for the last 8 years, being in the States and traveling and Saskatchewan. So I wanted to come back home and find work there. So I ended up applying for Canada Video Relay. And what that is it's a video relay service for deaf and hard of hearing people. So deaf people can't just make a phone call like you guys can. We have to go through a third-party video relay. So it's sort of like Zoom, but a different platform. And so my role was community outreach. I went out into the community trying to raise awareness and get people in the know and ready. This only was released in Canada in 2016, if you can imagine. We just have had video relay calling for such a short time. And it has made such a change and positive impact to the deaf community. Imagine this whole time beforehand, having to rely on friends and family to make phone calls and personal phone calls. I just can't believe that 2016 was when it happened. I was like 22. Do you imagine being 22 and asking my mom, hey, can you call the doctor for me? Ugh. So this really helped deaf folks with their autonomy and access by having the video relay. So then after that, I applied for a job at UBCO. They had posted a position as an accessibility advisor with the Disability Resource Center. I was like, this sounds like something that would be right up my alley. As a person with a disability, I felt that I would be a great person to be in that position, to understand the needs better of students who have various disabilities, physical, mental health disabilities, being deaf, any kind of disabilities that are causing barriers within the academic system. My job is to try to get rid of those barriers. And now with that, I have a designated interpreter, which is Jill. And this does not happen everywhere. I'm very fortunate that UBCO hired a full-time interpreter to make sure that I had full access to do my job properly. So that's sort of my history so far with education, with life. Sounds pretty great. Sounds pretty cake, but it wasn't all cake. It is not easy being a deaf person in a hearing world. If you take a look at Kelowna, there's a handful of deaf people compared to the rest of the hearing society and community. And so being one person in quite a big community makes it very difficult. And the academic system, the school districts, all of that are not created for deaf people. So we had to do a lot of fighting. Thankfully, my parents were great advocates and has then taught me how to be an advocate for myself. I would sometimes show up in class and there'd be no interpreter. So then I don't get to learn that day. As an example, I'm counting on other people to give me access. And so I've experienced quite a lot of that sort of oppression in my life. And that's just society. You know, that's how a lot of society looks at people with a disability. I don't mind being labeled disabled. That is a-okay by me. But we're automatically reduced to a lower level and have to fight so much harder to just have parity. And that's it's such a challenge. And another big thing that happens for deaf folks, because the education system is not put in place with deaf people in mind, deaf kids are language deprived because they don't have ASL in the house, they don't have ASL at school, and so they're missing that foundation of language, and it carries over for many, many years. Let me give you an example of some oppression that I experienced in my life. Sort of a funny story. I was driving. Yes, I was driving. Deaf people are allowed to drive. We have licenses. And I was pulled over. A police car pulled me over. I saw the lights flash. I had no idea why he pulled me over. It turns out I had a tail light out. And so I'm trying to communicate with the police officer and kind of going back and forth. And police officer was like, wait a minute, you're deaf? Let me see your license. I'm like, okay, here's my license. He looks at it and was like, deaf people can drive. No. Impossible. This is a fake. This is a fake license. Took my license. I had already been driving for 10 years. I couldn't drive home. They took my license for a month. I had to go in and fight and get my license back. Turns out, of course, it was the police officer's fault who didn't have appropriate training put in place. And yet I was the one that had to experience that sort of feeling of being less than and not having the access that I deserved to have. Another example would be socializing. In a hearing world and one deaf person, I see everybody laughing and I'm like, oh my gosh, what's so funny? And they're like, I'll tell you later. Okay. Or everyone's responding. I see something happening and they're responding. I'm like, oh, what happened? They're like, no, it's not important. I miss so much information in that way. All that information that's happening around me, no one is giving me access to it. And it can be very frustrating. And I could just get mad at the world for not, changing to suit my needs, but that's not going to get me anywhere. I needed to look at this in a positive way and advocate for myself, turn those negative experiences into power for myself and for the deaf community. So instead of getting mad and raging, I rose up and I became more of an advocate. And I think being an advocate is one of the most important things that someone in a minority position can do. It looks like I'm running out of time, and I want to quickly give you a little bit of information about deaf culture. And as a deaf person, our culture is one of the richest and most beautiful things that we hold on to and use as our identity. Because we have a language, it means we have a culture. And the deaf people really hold on to that identity. It means so much, just like your identity, where you're from, who you are. You need to be able to hold on to something that gives you that identity. And as a deaf person, that is my identity. My culture and my language tell me who I am. And I find that so rich. What sort of an example? Well, of course, we had deaf schools all over the States and all over Canada. And because of that, we have our very rich deaf culture, deaf language, deaf poetry, deaf artists, deaf jokes, deaf comedians. But unfortunately, we have a system that looks at deafness in a medical perspective. And their plan, their hope, their goals, their dreams are focusing on that lack and that deafness. So they, scientists want to cure deafness. They invent cochlear implants and hearing aids and this as a cure for deafness. But we don't see that as a cure. That means you're trying to get rid of us and our rich language and who we are. So it's sticky. Cochlear implants and hearing aids are tools that help and support for language access, but not to cure deafness. Anyway, that was just my 2 bits on the science part there. I value very much my identity as a deaf person, and this is just my experience. Every deaf person has their own experience, just like every hearing person has their own experience, and it's different. But the key would be that, for example, myself, I really hold true to the quote that deaf people can do everything except hear. And that line just really resonates with me to remind myself that whenever I think I can't do it and there's a barrier, no, I can, and I will fight through it and I will work through it and I can do what I need to do. There's lots of, positive things and negative things that come from being a minority, but most importantly, I have an identity and I have a self-determination to rise up to any level I want to. I think that about covers it. I think I'm probably out of time. Tobias, are there any questions out there? We can't hear you, Tobias. Sorry. I was like, it's really quiet.
Sorry, it's I thought I hit unmute and I didn't.
That's okay. No, that's okay.
I just put the link to the chat or the Q&A in the chat. Feel free, audience, to either type your questions into that link and I will relay them to Bree, or we can put them in the chat room itself. But thank you very much, Bree, for sharing your story. It was really inspiring to hear kind of your sense of self. The acknowledgement that you're an advocate, to be an advocate, that piece about the culture, it makes us think, being in a hearing world, how good we have it sometimes, and yet at the same time, I would look at, and you mentioned that, we might view it as a negative to be hard of hearing, and you painted a very nice picture of all the positives and all the things that, a different perspective for us to kind of hear about it that way. And so I hope that's an inspiration to some of the students that are listening, that maybe are minorities and see themselves see themselves in a different light. So one of the questions that just came in said, how long did it take for you to learn ASL?
Sorry, just a second. I just have to change the view. Great, thank you. That's a great question. So it varies. For people who are learning ASL, it could take 5 to 7 years to become really fluent. As a hearing person learning ASL, it can take quite a long time to become fluent. And be able to sign at that sort of level. For myself, I had no choice. I just picked it up as I went about the world. The same way you learned how to talk was the same way that I learned how to sign. Yeah.
Another question came in. Just around. Oops, they're moving quickly. Question said, can you talk at all? Do you have any abilities to speak?
Thank you for your question. Yeah, so many people have asked me. I have a voice. My voice works. And I did not really practice learning to speak. That was one of my choices in my life. I know that a lot of deaf and hard of hearing students can speak, or people can speak. Maybe they had a lot of work with a speech and language pathologist, but I don't talk. That was just a choice that I made. I can yell if I'm trying to get somebody's attention, but I don't talk. But I have a voice.
Another comment came in from GMS. So one of the students, Nazira, found your speech very inspiring, especially because he's the youngest of six children and the only one who's deaf in the family. Or sorry, because you're the youngest of six and being the only one who's deaf in the family. Bunch of comments about it being a wonderful presentation. Did you ever, here's a question, did you ever wish you could hear? Did you ever go through a period of time where you kind of wished that you could hear?
That is a great question. Unfortunately, once in a while, I kind of wish I could. When I was young and didn't know the world yet, and I was like just sort of on my own, and I didn't know how to really advocate for myself. And gosh, as a teenage girl, how hard it was to connect with the other girls. I wished that I could hear at that time. But as I matured and got older, I was sort of sometimes thankful I couldn't hear and like sleep through the noise. But yeah, I have had that.
Another question. So what is your favorite hobby or your favorite pastime?
Oh boy. Well, in the wintertime, I love snowboarding. I am on the hill, Silver Star, every weekend. In the summer, I love hiking. I'm a very outdoorsy person. I was part of the soccer club and I enjoyed that. So those things. Yeah.
Another question here around learning ASL. How does someone learn ASL? I think the question comes because students are used to receiving instruction verbally and hear it. So I think the question is like, how would you go about learning ASL?
That's a good question. I mean, really, in general, if you wanted to learn ASL, it's obviously visual based. The way so many hearing people learn is auditory based. You're listening to something and you're processing it. But if something is visual, you can connect what you're seeing to the gestures, to that symbol. But as for, say, the English words, that can be later. It's becoming a symbol, becoming a representative of that thing, and it just develops. Our ability to process visually is so rich. I'm not sure if that answers your question. Maybe ask again.
No, that was good. Yeah, I mean, any other questions? Yeah, they said yes, thank you. Okay, well, thank you again to Bree. I'm just looking at, our time is up.